Please join me in welcoming Sarah Thompson.
All right, thank you, Jasmine, for the introduction, and thank all of you for coming today. My title is Hokusai, the End of an Era, but of course, the end of one era is the beginning of another. So what I really will look at today is aspects of the work of Hokusai that hint at what is going to come later on after his death. So he lived from 1760 to 1849, a period when all kinds of things were happening in the world, and there are many interesting aspects of historical developments that we can find in Hokusai's work, especially his woodblock prints. So I'm going to be looking at technology, including both Hokusai's use of technology and also aspects of technology that we can see in his work. And then one special component within that is his use of Western perspective and how that came about. I'll also talk a bit about travel as we see it in the works of Hokusai. There's a little hint down here at the bottom. And I'll talk just at the end about storytelling. And these are all things that are aspects of his work that reflect what was going on at the time, but also when you know what is going to happen next at the end of the 19th century, you can see some hints of what is to come. Now, we had an excellent introduction last week. I came to Professor Maxey's lecture last week, and I was very impressed with the way he set the stage and explained very clearly what was going on in Japan during Hokusai's lifetime. So I'm going to just remind you of some of the things that he talked about and that I will be referring to also. And you may want to have a look at the sheet of handouts. Again, most of this vocabulary is not new at all, but you had it already last week, and I'll just repeat it in a slightly different context. So here's the map of Japan. There are 4 big islands. These are modern maps, of course, so it's got modern place names, but 4 big islands and a number of small ones. Hokusai mostly worked on the island of Honshu, the big main island. In terms of size, Japan is roughly about the size of California, so that gives you the approximate idea of the geographical area that we're dealing with. And in Hokusai's time, there were 3 big cities that were very, very important. One of the characteristics of this period, known as the Edo Period, because Japan was governed from the city of Edo, which we know today as Tokyo. There we go. Think of it as Edo for Hokusai purposes. So the 3 big cities were Edo, which was where the shogun had his headquarters. The shogun was the military dictator who ruled Japan in the name of the emperor. The emperor already was a figurehead, so it wasn't that different in the late 19th century when they switched over to a British-style constitutional monarchy and had a prime minister instead who was ruling in the name of a figurehead emperor. Excuse me. The emperor was located in the city of Kyoto. Let's see, here we can look at this closer up map. So there's Edo, there is Kyoto. That had been the capital of Japan ever since 794, and it actually technically was still the capital all the way up until 1868, because the capital in Japan is defined as where the emperor is. In 1868, the emperor moved to Tokyo, and that was when they changed the name of the city. But already it was the real administrative center throughout Hokusai's lifetime. And then the third of the 3 big cities was the city of Osaka, still a very important large city today, and especially known as the city of the merchants in those days. 2 other cities that were important for Hokusai that we'll mention from time to time, the city of Nagoya. It's between Edo and Kyoto, though a little bit closer to Kyoto. There is Nagoya, and of course it is special for us here at the MFA because we have a sister museum there today, the Nagoya-Boston MFA. And another important city here on the southern island of Kyushu, the city of Nagasaki. So what is important about Nagasaki is that during the Edo period, that was the port through which Japan had its very limited contact with the rest of the world. Now, this is known as the period when Japan was largely cut off from the outside world. The name of that policy was Sakoku Seisaku, the seclusion policy. The Tokugawa clan of shoguns who ruled Japan absolutely banned any Japanese, no matter how high-ranking, from going abroad. If you were Japanese, you could not leave Japan. If you got shipwrecked or something and tried to come back, you were likely to be executed. So anybody that left had to stay away. And foreigners could only come to Japan under very tightly controlled circumstances. There were 4 countries that Japan did have trade with. Korea, the closest country, and that was the only one that they actually had full diplomatic relations with. They traded with China, but not officially, because Japan at that time did not recognize the government of China. The dynasty had changed back in 1644, and the Japanese had supported the previous Ming dynasty and did not recognize the Qing dynasty that took over. So they let Chinese merchants come in, but they did not have diplomatic relations with China. Similarly, they allowed merchants from the Netherlands to come, but they did not have official diplomatic relations. The Ryukyu Islands were a little more complicated. That is the chain of islands down here, which today is part of Japan. It is Okinawa Prefecture in Japan. But at that time, it was an independent country, and they did have a relationship not with the shogun's government in Edo, but with the Satsuma domain here on Kyushu, which in turn had a relationship with the shogun's government. So that was a little more complicated, but that was the situation. The reason why the Netherlands, of all the European countries, was the one that they allowed in was that in the previous century, actually from about the 1540s to the 1630s, Japan had had very extensive contact with Europe. There had been people, especially from Spain and Portugal, which were the great world powers at that time, also from other countries, including England. There had been visits to Japan. There were 2 Japanese embassies that went to Rome to visit the Pope during that time. But eventually, after the Tokugawas took power and put an end to the Civil War that had been going on for over a century, they decided that it was just too dangerous, too many problems. They threw out all the Europeans except the Dutch. They strictly banned Christianity. The missionaries were a big part of the problem. They strictly banned Christianity. Practicing Christianity could get you executed also, although there were people who did it secretly. But the Dutch had never sent missionaries. They'd never tried to proselytize. They just wanted to trade and make money, and that was okay with the Japanese. So they did maintain the relationship with them. So that is what was going on. However, as Professor Maxey explained last week, the shogun's government was very well informed. The Dutch were required to write reports every year and tell the Japanese in detail what had happened in Europe. So they did know what was going on. I am going to be showing a lot of pictures by Hokusai that come out of this very interesting work that is in the exhibition. You may not have noticed it because it's small and it's black and white rather than in color, but we have a very interesting set of drawings for a picture book that was never published. We don't have the exact date, but probably about 1823. There was in 1823 an advertisement for a book that sounds like this one, but that book never appeared, so maybe that's what this is. It looks like something printed, and in fact, those outlines are printed. So Hokusai, it's not signed, but it looks exactly like his style. It's got to be him. Hokusai did the drawings within this framework, then if the book had been published, the drawings would have been destroyed. They would have been glued face down to the wooden blocks, and the block cutters would have cut through them to make the book. But it didn't happen. We don't know why. For some reason, the book was not published, but the drawings survived. The book, the construction of a Japanese book, actually, these are different pages, but no, I take it back. These are different sides of the same. That fold there it's two photographs, but that fold there is the same fold there. You're looking at two different sides of a sheet of paper that's been folded in half, and then the cut part is bound together with a string binding. This is how Japanese books were typically made because the paper was thin, and you couldn't really, in practical terms, print on both sides. So the reason I'm showing you these pages, even though these are not among the pages that are on display in the exhibition, is that it's Hokusai's drawings of the 4 social classes that, in theory, and I emphasize in theory, were the hierarchy in Edo period Japan. It's from a section dealing with different kinds of people, so ignore the picture at the far right. That is people of different ages, old people and little children. But then he starts here with the 4 social classes. And remember, in Japanese books and pictures, you are expected to read the text or the image from right to left. So we're looking from right to left. So the 4 classes, here are the samurai, and he gives 2 examples. Here is an actual warrior in armor, and then here is an older man in formal clothing who would be a lord of some kind. He might be a daimyo, one of the local rulers who governed the country directly under the shogun. So they are the rulers. Then the next most important, the peasant class who grow the food. And then classes 3 and 4 are the artisans, and here is a carpenter with his tools, and the merchants, and the merchant is weighing something with a little handheld scale. So those are the 2 lower classes. Merchants theoretically are parasites and are the lowest and so forth, but in fact, in this society that developed in Japan beginning in the 17th century, often they were richer than many of the poorer samurai. Now, Hokusai himself and most of his audience belonged to the group known as chonin in Japanese. It translates as townspeople. Those are the people in big cities who are a combination of the artisan and merchant classes. So that was Hokusai's own personal origins. And the first aspect of technology that I want to talk about in connection with Hokusai is, of course, the technology of printing. This became very important in Japan beginning in the 17th century, first printed books, and then from the 1680s on, printed pictures, which, as we'll see, developed out of the book publishing industry. It's very interesting. There's some comparative study that needs to be done. People are aware of this, but nobody has really looked carefully at the details. The spread of printing and publishing in Europe versus the spread of printing and publishing in Japan. The interesting thing is that in Europe, this great sudden flourishing of printed books is traced to the development of movable type printing by Gutenberg beginning in 1455. Then suddenly there began to be far more printed books than there had ever been before. Now, the interesting thing is that something similar happens in Japan in the 17th century, but it's not because of a technological development. The Japanese knew about movable type, but they rejected it, as Professor Maxey told you last week. They actually found out about it from 2 sources at about the same time. By coincidence, Gutenberg was not actually the first to print books using movable metal type. It had already been done in a separate development by the Koreans about 100 years earlier. The Chinese had had sort of started trying to develop the technique, but they never quite worked it out because they were using wood and ceramic for the type. You really need metal type if you're going to be reusing it. It has to be very sturdy. The Koreans did it successfully. And Japan had a war with Korea in the 1590s. They found out about the Korean use of movable type, and at the same time, they found out about it from the Europeans. The Jesuits were actually printing books in Romanized Japanese in Japan. However, when the Japanese tried it out for themselves, they did it and they decided they didn't like it. And we don't really know why not. Many suggestions have been made. The Japanese writing system is complicated, so there are lots and lots and lots of symbols. It's not an easy thing to reuse the type. Also, the Japanese really liked pictures in their books. So if you are having lots of pictures anyway, you might as well carve out the text on a single block of wood the same way you do the pictures. So again, this hasn't really been studied, don't exactly know, but using this woodcut, wood block technology, the Japanese did have an enormously successful printing and publishing industry from the 17th century on. As I said, it started with printed books, catering to this new population in the big cities. Urbanization is one of the big developments that happens in Japan in the 17th century, and there is a great rise in the rate of literacy. So suddenly there are lots more people who want books and have not a lot of money, but a little bit, so printing becomes a very profitable business. In the case of the printed pictures, they developed out of the printed books, and it's important to remember that these are not art prints being created by the artist. The artist is just one of many employees. The person who really controls the whole thing is the publisher. The artist draws it, the block cutter cuts the blocks, the printer prints them. And we have a demonstration of modern reproductions being made by the old method at the end of the exhibition. From about the 1680s on, the publishers had the clever idea that if they could sell books full of pictures, they could also sell pictures as a new product line in addition to the books. So we begin to get single-sheet woodblock prints. It's the beginning of this great art form of Japanese printmaking. The style of art is called ukiyo-e, literally pictures of the floating world. And the floating world is that world of popular culture in the big cities. Now, ukiyo-e is not limited to prints. It also includes the paintings that you can see in the show, the book illustrations that the prints come out of, but it is very strongly associated with prints. So there is an early example by Moronobu, considered the first known ukiyo-e artist. It's important to remember these are a commercial product. They're very competitive. So the publishers are constantly trying to get one up on each other and make their products look more beautiful than the next guy's. They began to put hand coloring on. They didn't have color printing yet, but here's a very beautiful example from our collection of an early hand-colored print from the early 1700s. Beginning in the 1740s, they started experimenting with printing in color. And here you see on the left a print with 3 different colors in addition to the black outline. The breakthrough came in 1765. That was when, on a large scale, the Japanese began to produce prints in full color. Full color is defined as 5 or more color blocks in addition to the black outline block. And this artist, Suzuki Harunobu, was the first who designed prints that were printed in full color. Remember, he didn't do the printing himself, but he designed them. So there is one of the early limited color prints, and then the gorgeous full color print that you see. For bigger images, It was customary not to try to print a whole big sheet of paper, but to do it in sections. There was a standard size, roughly about 15 inches high by 10 inches wide, or the other way around in the case of a horizontal print. That's the size of the Fuji prints. It's about the size of a big manila envelope is one description of it. This was just about what one person could handle in the printing process. So there's a very beautiful work from about 1789. This would be when Hokusai himself was a young artist, but this was by the top artist of beautiful women of that time, showing a group of people visiting Enoshima. And you notice here the landscape is a background for the figures. There were a few prints showing just landscape, but it didn't become an important subject until Hokusai made it one in 1830. And also notice the perspective. This is a kind of the traditional Asian perspective where you show that things are far away by putting them higher up in the picture plane. So if you try to look at this in a rational way with modern Western eyes, it almost looks as if the ground plane is tilted up. But as we'll see, a Western perspective was coming in already at that time. Now, the interesting thing about these Japanese full-color prints is that in this respect, the technology was actually slightly ahead of what was available in Europe. The Japanese did not invent full-color printing. There had actually been examples done in China sometime before, but only on a relatively limited scale. In Japan, it became very popular, very widespread, and relatively inexpensive. So these were something very, very affordable. And interestingly enough, although full-color printing was done in Europe, it was still relatively expensive, and so in the early 19th century, popular prints, were either just in black and white, or if they were colored, the coloring was put on by hand, whereas the Japanese were doing full-color printing. It was such a satisfactory way of producing full-color pictures that it actually persisted even after Western printing methods came to Japan. So this is from the 1880s, and you can see it's that very same, it's a woodblock color print, a triptych, it's exactly the same size as the one from a century before that we just saw. And this lasted right up until the beginning of the 20th century. At which point, finally, the woodblock prints were replaced by things like photographs and lithography and so on, although they continued to be made as an art form. So that is the technology. Here, by the way, you also see by now the Western perspective is completely absorbed and is being used in the print. So Hokusai comes between these two prints that you've just seen. Here are his wonderful landscapes of the 1830s. The way that the prints were made was already established and did not change in that 100-year period when he was working. However, there was something brand new that led to his development of these landscapes, and that was the new color. It's known as Prussian blue in English. The Japanese called it Berlin blue. It was one of those things that trickled in from Europe, and remember, as Professor Maxey explained last week, it was luxury goods that were coming in. The Japanese were self-sufficient, but they liked interesting, exotic goods, and something like a beautiful pigment would have been very interesting to them, and indeed was. It was invented in Germany in the 18th century. The Japanese had known about it for some time, but it had been expensive. What happened in the late 1820s, it suddenly became much cheaper, and apparently that was because not only was it coming in via the Dutch traders, but also the Chinese began to import it to Japan as well. So more of it was available, the price went down, and either Hokusai or his publisher, we don't know who, but someone had the brilliant idea, let's do landscape prints using this. So the Fuji series was a huge bestseller. Landscape became an important subject matter in Japanese prints. Now, That's Hokusai's use of technology, printing technology. I want to look just briefly at some very interesting examples of Hokusai's depictions of different kinds of technology. Hokusai loved ships and boats, and he liked to draw them in detail. So down below is another two-page spread from that book of drawings, that set of drawings for a book that was never published. And here are two prints from the Fuji series. You see here, both in this early Fuji print and the drawing here, that is a cargo boat with roofed quarters for the crew and a detachable mast so that they can sail if they're in suitable circumstances. And then here is a different type of boat that is a large, heavy freighter carrying goods along the coast. And Hokusai is very interested in all the details. He loves to draw people working, and he's very interested in drawing machinery. So the water wheel is, of course, one of the prints from the views of Fuji. And I was very interested to see that in the book of drawings, and by the way, this two-page spread is exhibited so you can see these actual drawings. Here he shows what could be the same water wheel, but he has cut away the wall so that you can look inside and see what's going on. And I think what they're doing using the water power is threshing rice. There are these piston-like things that are being turned by the water wheel and pounding something. I suspect what's going on there is loosening the hulls from the rice or some other grain. And then on the facing page, and really, remember you read from right to left, so really this ought to come after that scene. But this is a hand-operated machine, which was actually invented in China back in the 13th century, but it is a winnowing machine. Once you separate the chaff from the grain, then it's still all mixed together, and so you've got to get rid of those inedible casings. And the traditional way of doing it was to have your threshed grain in a basket and toss it in the air so the wind would blow the chaff away. But here was a nifty mechanical device that you could use when the wind was not blowing. You pour the grain, all mixed with the hulls, into this hopper at the top. The man here is turning a crank, and inside the round part there is a fan. But it's all enclosed so that the air blows out the far end. It blows away the chaff with it, and the grain, which is heavier, drops down, and here you see it coming out. Now, Hokusai often takes liberties with his drawings. Needless to say, people going to all this trouble are not going to let their good rice go spilling out on the ground like that. It would be falling into some kind of basket or container, but he's drawn it this way so you can see what's going on. So the mechanical water wheel. He shows not only agricultural machinery, but he then goes on to show the making of textiles. There are a number of scenes of silk production, culminating with this very interesting, complicated loom. And then you see a store where the beautiful finished textiles are being stored. Now, interestingly enough, at the very same time that Hokusai is making these drawings and drawing water wheels and looms and things of that kind in Japan, in other parts of the world, industrialization is just getting going. You may have been to some of the museums in Lowell, Massachusetts. This is one of them, showing the mechanized looms, and the mills in Lowell began to be built starting in 1821. So just at the time when Hokusai is doing those drawings of hand-operated looms in Japan, we're just starting the mechanical looms in this country, and those were based directly on the earlier ones made in England just a short time before. So the Japanese are behind the rest of the world, or at least the more developed parts of the world, but not by centuries, but only by decades. So here's what's going on very close to here. The mills were operated by water power. They were built in Lowell and in Lawrence because of the swift flow of the Merrimack River at that point. The river water turned big turbines. When you go to the museums, they'll show you these things. It's very interesting. And the turbines, through a system of gears, would turn drive shafts that then operate the individual looms. So it is on water power. So the Japanese have got the water power, they've got the hand-operated looms. They're not that far away from this. What they don't have yet, or at least not on this scale, is the turbines and the gears. But they have the general idea already. Here is another page from that set of drawings by Hokusai, again showing his fascination with machinery. And what we see here is, it looks like figures until you look at the bottom of it, and then you realize it's actually mechanical dolls. And the little labels say things like, this says gears, machinery, puppets or dolls, hollow puppets, and hollow presumably because there's a mechanism inside. So in the 19th century, they made a number of these mechanical dolls in Japan. You can find quite a bit of information about these online because they are often seen as prototypes of Japanese developments in robotics. So the one up here, this is a tea-serving doll, and it would walk forward carrying a tray with a cup of tea. So you could actually be served tea by the doll. The one below is especially interesting because it shoots an arrow. It actually pulls arrows out of the quiver, draws the bow, and you have to position the target correctly, but it hits the target. And I'll tell you more about that one in a moment. The technology did come from Europe. Apparently these began to be made in France in the early 18th century. The earliest record I could find is in 1727. An inventor in France made mechanical dolls that served food that probably were very, very similar to the Japanese tea-serving doll. I don't know whether anyone has found out exactly how this came to Japan, but it's just the kind of luxury item that the Dutch would have imported, and the Japanese were entirely capable of reverse engineering it, figuring out how it worked, and building their own. So Hokusai this is not a serious diagram. That's not actually, it would be much more complicated to operate something like this, but he gives you the general idea. In terms of the iconography, this is actually, these are Chinese figures that are depicted in the mechanical dolls. The fat guy with the big earlobes, who is beating a drum. When I was a child, my brother had a battery-operated monkey that beat a drum. So this is something very similar, except it's clockwork rather than batteries. But that is Hotei, one of the 7 gods of good fortune in Japan. He's actually derived from an ancient Chinese historical figure, a Zen Buddhist monk, and there you see a painting of him, not by Hokusai, but by another Japanese artist around the same time. He's this very jolly, friendly character, and he's often seen with Chinese children. So here you see a Chinese child acrobat, and as he beats the drum, this little mechanical figure does somersaults down a ladder. And looks quite a bit like the Chinese child acrobats that Hokusai drew perched on the calligraphy for long life that was done by a friend of his, who was, I believe, the friend who did the calligraphy was, I believe, 98, and Hokusai was 85 when he did this. But just to show you the Chinese child, very similar, look at that. Chinese child acrobats. And then the figure that shoots the arrow is another figure from Chinese mythology. There were once extra suns in the sky. It was too hot, and so the gods asked a great archer to shoot them all down except for one. So that's what's going on. This disc with the bird is one of the extra suns. In Chinese mythology, there's a crow in the sun. And so the archer also is in Chinese costume, shooting down the crow. Now, the arrow shooting doll, which I found online, has a fascinating history. It is one of the treasures today of the Toshiba Corporation, that electronics giant. And it was built by one of their founders, and there he is. That's a photograph of what he looked like when he was an old man. But when he was in his 20s, again, just at the time when Hokusai was doing these drawings, just at the time that they were building mills in Lowell, this, at the time, young man was building mechanical dolls. So he built the doll that could shoot an arrow, and I really wonder whether he could possibly have been the designer of the mechanical dolls that Hokusai depicts here. We don't know. But much later on, this man, Tanaka Hisashige, actually designed the first steam engines that were built in Japan. Much later, when the Japanese had decided that, yes, they would go ahead with industrialization. And in 1875, he founded an engineering company that eventually, in the 20th century, merged with some other companies to become the Toshiba Corporation. So that is, as I said, is one of their treasures today. Now, dolls like this were expensive toys for wealthy people. However, there were also large dolls that were displayed in public displays. One of the interesting things that's in the show, you can see this print here. It's rather large, about like that. It's not especially beautiful because it was not printed in color. It was cheap printing because what it was an advertisement. It was intended to be pasted on walls, kind of a billboard thing, just to be stuck up here and there, and it is an announcement of an exhibition of life-size dolls. That was going to be displayed in the fairgrounds behind the great temple of Sensoji in Asakusa. So Hokusai, usually it was fairly minor artists who did these, but somebody thought it was interesting enough and important enough that they commissioned Hokusai to do it. Because he was very good at drawing Chinese figures. These, again, are figures in Chinese costume. And also he was very good at mechanical things, of which he has drawn here. So what these dolls represent, and they were probably either life-sized or close to it. These were large dolls for a public display. It's the Chinese Lady in the Moon and her entourage. The Lady in the Moon, according to Chinese mythology, actually was the wife of the archer who shot down the extra sons. Although, sadly, they became estranged. What happened was that the gods wished to reward the archer for helping them out. And so they gave him the elixir of immortality. Drink it and you become immortal. Unfortunately, when they came around to his house to deliver it, no one was home. So they left the precious bottle of elixir and went away. The first one that came home, you know what's coming, was his wife. She drank it. And then she realized that, immortal or not, her husband was going to be very angry with her when he came home, and she had better get out of there. So she ran away and went to the moon. And she became the Lady in the Moon. This was a good excuse for beautiful figures in Chinese costume, and that is the carriage of the Lady in the Moon, pulled by oxen, and it advertises that it actually moves. And then in keeping with this astrological or astronomical theme, here are the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, but they are figures who perform a dance, all mechanical dolls. And then most interesting of all, the Lady in the Moon has attendants, and these are mechanical dolls operating a silk reeling machine. And this wonderful, miraculous silk reeling machine can reel or can roll up 6 reels of silk at the same time. Again, it's a gear system. This lady is turning the gears, and it operates these kind of spindles that roll up 6 reels of silk at once. This was a remarkable, almost miraculous thing in 1827. 50 years later, the real thing, the very latest in high technology of 1877, is being displayed in Japan at the Japanese National Industrial Exposition. And this print, by the way, the very print that you see here, that is currently at an exhibition in Japan on the arts of the Meiji period, because it's such a great example of what happened in Japan in the 1870s, which you'll be hearing more about in the future lectures. But I love the fact that in 50 years we've gone from almost fantasy, or really it is fantasy if you consider this is taking place on the moon as far as Hokusai is concerned. So imagining what happens on the moon and showing what is really happening in Japan right now. Now, Western perspective. This can be seen as an aspect of technology and certainly of a contact with the West. As I mentioned, traditional Asian perspective shows distant things by putting them high up in the plane, the picture plane. The Japanese found out about a Western perspective in the 1740s. Again, Western books and pictures were allowed into Japan, provided they didn't mention Christianity. And for some reason, why they didn't find out about it sooner, I don't know, but artists became interested in this technique in the 1740s. It was not considered to be the great scientific, philosophical discovery that it was seen as in Renaissance Europe. The Japanese saw it as just a kind of fun game, a kind of an optical illusion. You could use it for stage sets. You could use it in toys, as we'll see in just a minute. But there was a whole group of rather large perspective pictures like this that began to be made in Japan in the 1740s. I love this one because it's a mix of a Western and Asian perspective, as you can see. In the main part of the picture, the receding lines converge. They go toward what ought to be a vanishing point on the horizon about here. However, the landscape that you're seeing through or on the far side of this balcony, so this is an elegant restaurant or other building of some kind on the river in the summer. People are enjoying the lovely cool air after a hot day. But in the background landscape, it's completely in the old perspective. So you kind of don't have a horizon for the converging lines to vanish toward. So it's not quite fully understood yet. Here is a work from the 1750s, and now you can see this artist does really completely understand it. He gets it. That is actually a print. It's not an ukiyo-e print. It was made in Kyoto by this artist, Maruyama Okyo. He later became a very famous, very successful artist, really the top artist in Japan in the 18th century. But as a young man, he did work for a toy store. And one of the toys sold in the store was little peep show gadgets, a little box that you would put a picture in. You would look through a lens, and usually there would be a mirror inside also. The grid across the top is to let light in, but not too much light. And here is that same print. This is the real one in our collection. This is a replica, and the reason they've reversed it is it would be reversed when you looked at it in the little box, because there's a mirror inside there as well as the lens. So these were called floating pictures because when you looked through the lens, this is a modern mock-up, you'd see something like that. It was as if there was another little world in there. Japanese really liked these things, but they didn't take it very seriously. It was just kind of a fun toy. And here actually is one of the little peep show boxes. This is an early work by Hokusai. It shows three little boys who are actually acting out a play, but they have some other toys lying around on the floor that they were playing with before they decided to put the play on. And right here, behind this kid's posterior, you see the little box with the grid on the top and then the little lens that you would look through to see a magical-looking scene inside. Here's another work by Utamaro showing an older sister as two little boys look into a bigger box. And there were also much bigger ones that, again, were displayed at the carnivals that you could look into. So those are the peep show boxes. In the 1780s, there was a fad for these perspective prints, and Hokusai drew quite a lot of them. He turned out to have a knack for this. So I've been saying that landscape prints were not important, but they were one of the things that were being made. They weren't nearly as popular or best-selling as prints of kabuki actors and prints of beautiful women, but things like this did provide a good income for struggling young artists like Hokusai. So often they were scenes of the city of Edo. That actually is the temple where the mechanical dolls were displayed. The area back behind the temple buildings with the trees is where the fairgrounds were. It was one of the most famous Buddhist, probably the most famous Buddhist temple in the city. This is a historical story that was also a very famous kabuki play. But Hokusai is showing it in this interesting way as if it were real. And then I love this one because it's such a combination of realism and fantasy. He uses the illusionistic vanishing point perspective, but it's a haunted house with all these terrific Hokusai-style monsters coming out. In the early 1800s, he did some small prints that were very deliberately imitating Western styles. This is from a set of surimono, the privately commissioned prints, and you can barely see it. This is, I think, one of the ancestors of the Great Wave. It's beautiful embossing. The surimono used very expensive techniques because the customers paid for them up front. It's one of a set, but you'll notice it has a frame, which Japanese pictures did not usually. And then to make it look Western, he wrote his signature sideways. At this period, Japanese was normally written up and down. Occasionally you would write things across, but there is the sideways signature. And furthermore, instead of writing it in Chinese-derived characters the way he usually would, this is what his signature would look like normally. But he spelled it out in the phonetic script, which is more cursive-looking, in addition to writing it sideways. Now, this is a wrapper for a complete set of 8 tiny little prints. They're little prints about like that directly imitate Western prints. By this time, some of those Japanese who were studying Dutch studies, which you learned about last time, had actually learned to do copperplate etchings and engravings, and those were being sold in the city of Edo, often quite small, because they were still kind of experimenting with the technique. These are woodblock prints, but they are deliberately imitating the Western-style engravings and etchings that are being sold. And it cracks me up. Hokusai used the horizontal lines that you use for shading when you are doing, for example, an etching. It's completely unnecessary in Japanese woodblock printing because the printer can put gradated ink on the block when he prints it. But that was a Western technique that Hokusai was using. And then these strange clouds with outlines are also a Western technique, so he's imitating them. This is the wrapper that the prints were sold in, and the title is the Dutch picture mirror. Actually, you could also say the Dutch picture lens, because the Japanese word for mirror was also used to mean lenses. So you would expect it to be one of those little peep show gadgets that we just looked at, but as you can see, that's not what he shows. That's a microscope. And he knew it was a microscope. I'll prove that shortly. So he's looking at the city of Edo through the Dutch microscope. What he does with that Western perspective after drawing all those floating pictures, years later, in the 1830s, when he has the beautiful blue to work with, and again, it's not a jump. He's been doing book illustrations all along and other kinds of prints, but he incorporates the Western perspective into the Fuji prints. And I am convinced that one of the reasons why Japanese prints were really the first non-Western art form that European artists discovered, I think partly, although they didn't realize it at the time and thought these were terribly exotic, but I think they could look at them and understand them because Hokusai was using Western perspective, or something very close to it. Now, he's doing it completely by eye, so if you try to do something like trace the lines all the way to the horizon, it won't quite come out properly, but it's close enough that you can read it that way, and it's highly intelligible to people who are used to a Western-style perspective. So I think these things were actually rather familiar to the Western viewers. Hokusai, however, was perfectly willing to fiddle with it. By this time, he totally understood how to do it, but he also felt free to change things if he wanted to. This is a beautiful example of one of the waterfall prints. It's the Amida Falls, which is called that because, according to legend, a priest saw a vision of Amida Buddha at that waterfall. Here's a photograph of the fall as it appears today. It's still very beautiful, still a sightseeing attraction. And you can see it does come out of a gap in the rocks, just as Hokusai has drawn, but the gap is pretty irregular. It's not beautiful and round as Hokusai drew it. So there are two possibilities. One is that maybe it eroded over the past century and a half. Maybe it was once rounder, but I think probably not. I think Hokusai distorted reality deliberately and made it round to suggest the halo of the Buddha in the vision that the priest saw. He's also done something else. When you, in reality, when you look straight at the waterfall, you do not see the stream above it that's feeding into it. And Hokusai, even though he perfectly well understands Western perspective, is also completely happy to violate it and to go back to the old system of just showing things higher up when they're far away. And so we get the beautiful rippling of the stream coming into the waterfall. Strictly speaking, it's not realistic, but who cares? Hokusai was very interested in lenses, in optics, and this might have something to do with the fact that as a child he was adopted by his uncle, who was a mirror maker, who made highly polished metal mirrors for the household of the shogun. So Hokusai had a very good education, and he was being trained to be a mirror maker, but he decided he didn't want to do that. However, he kept his interest in reflections. We have the beautiful painting, a very gorgeous, expensive work of a woman looking at her reflection in the mirror. And here is an example from the Fuji series that features a reflection, but it's also a case when Hokusai plays with reality. The real mountain is the way it appears in the summer, in high summer, when all the snow has melted off it. But look at the reflection. This is our image of Fuji in the other 3 seasons of the year when it has snow on it. And just as a further clue, the reflection is a little bit skewed. It's not directly under the mountain, but slightly off. So it's a very witty comment on your image of how things look and how they really look, and the fact that this may be a little off. There is that microscope that was on the wrapper of the miniature pictures, and here, unfortunately, this is not in our collection, but this is a surimono, a privately commissioned print by Hokusai of a microscope with a butterfly. Little does that poor butterfly realize it is probably just about to be pinned down and examined under the microscope. But just to prove that, yes, he did know what that gadget was. Telescopes were also familiar to Hokusai. This is a surimono in our collection showing a telescope in a still life with other objects. And here is a book illustration showing a group of ladies looking through a telescope. They don't have it pointed at Fuji in the background, but if they did, they might see something like that. These are the second and third most famous prints in the Fuji series after the Great Wave. But if you think about it, when you look at Fuji in real life, unless you happen to be in a plane flying past it, you see much more of the landscape than just the mountain itself. So where did Hokusai get the idea of showing it like that? Maybe he looked through a telescope. That's entirely possible, and I think it's very likely. Now, just briefly, I want to mention a couple of other things that we see in Hokusai's work. These have to do not so much with technology, but with some of the things that were going on in Japan during Hokusai's lifetime that will have an impact on the developments later in the century. One of those things is travel. Here's another map showing the 5 major roads that were maintained by the government and were heavily used, especially by the daimyo, the provincial lords, who were required to go back and forth, spending half their time with the shogun and half their time governing their domains. So these were the roads that were officially maintained by the government. The Tokaido is the most famous one, the Eastern Sea Road going from Edo along the coast to Kyoto. Then there was also a mountain route and some roads going up to the north. We know that Hokusai himself traveled. He went to Kyoto and Osaka on business. He stopped off in Nagoya, which is right about here. And had publishers publishing his books, also people wanting to study painting from him in those cities. And toward the end of his life, he went to a place called Obuse, which is near present-day Nagano, up in the north around this area. So he was very familiar with travel. This is a photograph from 1865 showing the Tokaido Road as it actually looked at that time. It's from a different angle, but just like the print that Hokusai shows. Here is a traveler dressed in a traveling costume, a big hat, sort of like wearing an umbrella. It would protect you from sun and rain. You would want a cloak. You would have leggings and socks with straw sandals tied over them. However, if you look carefully, you will see that is not actually a Japanese traveler. That is William Sturgis Bigelow. During his stay in Japan between 1882 and 1889, the man who donated about 80% of the works in the exhibition. And overall, about 60% of our total enormous Japanese print collection. We've had many donors. The total is well over 200, and I think roughly about 20 different donors in the Hokusai exhibition. But he was the biggest one of all and the core. And so there he is when he lived in Japan. We considered using this photo for our wall label about him, but in the end we went with a more dignified shot of him as he looked in later years as a trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts. And just to show you details of how people traveled on the Tokaido Road, although Japan had a good system of highways, it wasn't easy to use wheeled vehicles, at least not for much of the way. Japan is very mountainous. Even going along the coastal route, it was often quite steep. So mostly people walked. That was the typical way to get around. Well-off people might go in a sedan chair. You see there is a person sitting in this little contrivance, and 2 men will carry it on a pole. That is the more elegant way to travel. And you could also go part way on a horse. Now, only high-ranking samurai were permitted actually to ride horses on their own, but pack horses were commonly used to transport luggage, although anything really bulky or heavy went by boat. We saw the cargo boats that Hokusai drew. But as long as the horse was being led by a pack horse driver, you could sort of travel as if you were baggage yourself, and sit there with your luggage. And as in many of his prints, Hokusai has put in a little joke. You see this little symbol. It looks just like a kind of decorative mark, but it's actually the trademark of the publisher. And the character on the horse's saddle blanket is also one of the characters from the name of Hokusai's publisher. But just the fact that Japan did have a good road system connecting the different parts of the country, this was something that was going to be very important later on in getting these modernization and the various developments spread to different areas. Why did people travel? They traveled on business, as in Hokusai's case, and often they went on pilgrimage. It's a very interesting topic that definitely people have researched somewhat already, and more research can be done. But pilgrimage was often an excuse for tourism. Tourism was really getting going in Hokusai's day, but often the official excuse for going on a trip when really you wanted to see the beautiful sights would be that you would visit a famous temple or shrine. Japan had and has two religions that coexist, Buddhism and Shinto. The conventional translation for places of worship, Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines. And especially in the Edo period, they often were found together. So this particular waterfall, again, another one from the Waterfall series, is on Mount Oyama, which was fairly close to Edo. You basically could get there in a day and then come back the next day. So it was a popular pilgrimage spot. And here you see these men who are pilgrims who have climbed up the mountain, and now they are in the sacred waterfall, which must have felt really good after climbing up the mountain on a hot day. This is a board game by Hokusai. And it's a trip from Edo. Here you see Edo, and you go like this all the way to Mount Oyama. You don't see the waterfall, but there is the entire mountain up in the corner. And then Hokusai's little invention that makes this different from other board games is then you go back again. So this is the route home again after you've made the pilgrimage. So one of the reasons why people traveled. Of course, people also wanted to see the special scenic spots. There was a long tradition in Japan of poets writing poetry about beautiful scenery, and Hokusai drew beautiful scenery. This is his series, Snow, Moon, and Flowers. Snow, Moon, and Flowers were the three most beautiful things according to Chinese poetry. But Hokusai showed them in terms of Japanese landscapes. So it's snow on the Sumida River in Edo. It's the moon over the Yodo River close to Kyoto. And then flowers in Japan usually means cherry blossoms. In China, it meant flowers in general. In Japan, when you talk about flowers, it's cherry blossoms. The most famous ones of all are in the mountains of Yoshino, which is down south of Kyoto. And so that's what Hokusai shows. But one of the results of increased travel during the Edo period, and I think especially of the beautiful landscape scenes that Hokusai and other artists start drawing, is that people in Japan begin to get more and more of a sense of their country as a unified whole, and gradually start to think of themselves not just as belonging to one particular province or one particular area, but begin to get this idea of something unified. Now, we also see that in stories. The print culture is important in bringing a nation together, including both traditional stories and also new things based on traditional stories. Hokusai was very well known as a book illustrator. This is actually from a book by another artist, Kuniyoshi, published in 1845. And there you see Hokusai, not as the very old man that he was. In 1845, Hokusai was 86, or 85, excuse me. And there you see him as he looked several decades earlier. And together with the author that he especially collaborated with, Bakin, who wrote a new kind of fiction that became very popular in the early 19th century, and it was adventure stories, often with a historical setting, usually set in the distant past, and often with a fantasy element. So the book, The Crescent Moon Bow, written by Bakin, illustrated by Hokusai, was about a real historical figure of the 12th century. However, the real samurai Minamoto Tametomo was killed in the civil wars at that time. But This is a spin-off from his history. They see him as living on and traveling to the islands south of Japan, going to the Ryukyu Islands and to other fantasy islands, such as the Island of the Demons. Tametomo, the historical Tametomo, was a great archer, so he keeps that characteristic in the fantasy story, and there are the demons who can't even bend his bow because he is so powerful. At one point, he's shipwrecked when a sea monster overturns his ship. And so this is Hokusai's book illustration. The artist Kuniyoshi was very indebted to Hokusai. Kuniyoshi became famous for his warrior prints showing exploits of great heroes of the past or illustrations of these fantastic novels. So there's Hokusai's book illustration. Here's the color print that Kuniyoshi made of the shipwreck caused by the sea monster, clearly based on it. Then later on, Kuniyoshi did another version, which is a little more original, which is one of his major works. The hero, by the way, is saved by these flying creatures and goes on to have still more adventures. And I want at this point to put in a quick plug for fantasy. This kind of thing, which was very, very popular in early 19th century Japan, this is often seen as escapist or foolish, or, why are young people today not thinking about practical things instead of, indulging in these wild fantasies? I think it's good to stretch your imagination. And I think the fact that people in early 19th century Japan enjoyed reading about and looking at pictures of wild, fantastic adventures, I think it stood them in good stead later in that century, when a lot of things happened in Japan that were certainly very strange compared to what had been going on before. And so, the kid who reads about this Japanese hero traveling around to places like the Island of the Demons is, likely to be, brave and daring and go off and travel to Europe to study technology. So I think it's a good thing. Hokusai himself only did one series of warrior prints, and you see a gorgeous example there. This, again, is a historical figure. His name is Watanabe no Tsuna. And he was a real person, but his real story was greatly embroidered. There are many stories of him fighting demons and so on. So Hokusai drew him with a human opponent. Here is Tsuna fighting another armored figure, but he continues to appear in manga and so forth today, and just by quickly browsing online, I was able to find quickly 2 modern depictions of this hero. So that unifying function of the storytelling, when people have a sort of national heroes that everybody knows about, it's one of those things like being aware of the different geographical areas of your country. You are aware of these heroes that everyone can claim just by being Japanese. And here are some modern versions. I was particularly intrigued by the one on the upper right, because I strongly suspect that the artist had looked at Hokusai's print because of the color scheme. So you can see what you think. So these are the things that Hokusai did that hint at what is to come, and you'll hear about more in the following lectures. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions. We have a microphone on either side, so please raise your hand and we will bring the mic to you.
Did the Japanese prohibit Christianity because they were possibly aware of some of the abuses of missionaries toward native populations?
I suspect so. That was part. There were many reasons. I think that was part of it. I think the single biggest reason was that the Tokugawas did not want any of the other warlords who might be their competitors to make an alliance with the European countries. That was the biggest thing. Remember, during the period of extensive contact with Europe, there was a civil war going on in Japan, and the different factions were, gleefully making deals with the Europeans to try to get, they were all struggling to try to take control of Japan. Once the Tokugawas did, then yes. However, I think that was also a factor. I think they suspected the missionaries were ultimately up to no good. I can tell you what was the last straw. The crackdown on Christianity was gradual. They got more and more strict about it, and the last straw that led them to ban it completely was a peasant revolt in that southern island of Kyushu, down in an area down south of Nagasaki, which was led by a charismatic teenage boy who claimed to be the second coming of Christ. And they decided, that's it, no more Christianity. If this is what it leads to, forget it. So.
Thank you for that great lecture. One always reads that Hokusai influenced the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, but looking at some of those beautiful colors, notably the reds and the hot pinks, clearly he also influenced the Fauvists as well, and I found that so interesting.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and I definitely more can be. There is more that can be done in studying these things. One thing that for this exhibition and for most of the prints that I showed you, I carefully picked things that were not faded. I think one of the big attractions of the Japanese prints was that they were so colorful, and we don't always realize that because, for example, Monet's collection is still there. You can see it on the walls in his dining room, but it's all faded, whereas when he put it up, it would have been very bright and colorful. So yes, that's a good point, and I agree.
The wonderful woodblock exhibition at the end of the overall exhibition. Could a scholar or connoisseur, neither of which I am, look at an original print without the advantage of having the individual blocks and discern how many there were? Because I would not have been able to figure that out on Under the Wave.
Oh, you mean how many blocks were used for the original printing?
Exactly. There are such subtleties.
Yeah. Well, as I said, basically count the colors, but sometimes it's hard. And also, every now and then they cheated a little bit. If there was, for example, a small area of a color in one corner and a small area of a different color in another corner, they might use one block for two colors. Usually not, but you could get away with that if they were far enough apart that you could ink them without any danger of interfering. And there were various techniques such as the gradation that can make it difficult. Also, sometimes they did things like print one color over the other. So it's difficult. Yes, you can pretty much tell, but people do argue about it. And it's entirely possible that two experts might disagree about exactly how many color blocks were used.
So while Sturgis Bigelow was hoovering up this wonderful collection of his, which we're all enjoying now, would he have been interested in or understood the techniques of manufacture and, moreover, the scholarship behind some of the individual prints that you've exposed us to today?
I think he did understand the technique. I don't know who would have demonstrated it for him, but I think he was aware of how they were done. I don't know, when you say the scholarship, I assume you mean things like the stories that Hokusai is depicting. How much of that he knew about, I don't know. But certainly some of it. Things like the Chushingura story was so famous that everyone would have known about that, and there was even an English language version published as early as 1871. So we would have had some knowledge of it, but probably not in detail.
I have two questions. One of them concerns the opening up of Japan to the West.
Yes.
And in my reading, it focused on the American contribution to black ships.
Right.
But it occurs to me, and I wonder if it's so, that there might be a relationship between the Japanese interest in the Industrial Revolution and the fact, as I understand it, they lack coal and iron. So that if they were going to have an industrial revolution, they needed to trade in order to get raw materials. Is that so, or do you know?
Okay, this is more of a question for a political historian. What the Japanese did have, and that interestingly enough was also very important in early industrialization here, was water power. So that went along. It's true that they lacked other things, but they did have that, and that went a long way. I think the fact that it was Matthew Perry who finally succeeded in getting Japan to open up, that it was an American and not some other sea captain of a different nationality, was somewhat coincidental because other foreign countries had been trying. And I think, again, the shogun was very well aware of what was going on around them. And they probably realized that sooner or later they were going to have to establish some kind of contact. So what went through their minds and why they agreed to make a deal with him when other people had been put off, I'm not sure.
Thank you. The other question is personal. Do Japanese men tend to be bald like I am, or is that just the way they painted them conventionally?
It was the standard male hairstyle in the Edo period.
Did they shave?
Yes, they shaved, and occasionally, actually, it's way far back, so I don't know if I can find it. But that wonderful three-color print of the warrior, if you look very carefully, he has 5 o'clock shadow on his head. It's way back toward there. There we go. See, look. And yes, the head is shaved. Now, why that was the standard male hairstyle, I don't know. It would start a teenage boy who's approaching adulthood or past puberty but not yet legally adult would have the very top of his head shaved but would still have a lock of hair in front, neatly tied up, of course. And then in the adulthood ceremony, the whole top of the head would be shaved. I heard a rumor, but I never saw any substantiation of this, that the hairstyle was started by a shogun who was himself going bald and wanted everyone to look like him. But, but I don't really know. Yeah.
I'm going to go here first. And then...
You mentioned about being able to identify people in Chinese costume, and I wonder what the difference is between Chinese dress and Japanese dress that would make one of us able to differentiate the two. And also I wanted to comment about the spinning of the silk and the women being the ones working in what I would call the factory.
Right. Okay,
So the differentiation between the Chinese dress and the Japanese dress, can you offer some illustrations of that?
Okay.
Verbal or?
Right. These are Chinese costumes, or at least I should say this is the Japanese idea of Chinese costume, which is not necessarily authentic. The way the hairstyles are done is different, although I'm not at all sure those are actual Chinese women's hairstyles, but they're different from the way that the Japanese hairstyle would be done. It's kind of all piled up with floral decorations. There's a very distinct pattern to the Japanese hairstyle. You have the front, the sides, the top knot, the back, and the top knot. Whereas this is more piled up. Also notice, see the round collar? That's Chinese, or at least what the Japanese thought was a Chinese woman's outfit. There would be, you may have seen actual Chinese women's jackets, which typically have a round collar and fasten at the side near the shoulder, whereas the Japanese women are wearing kimono, and you pretty much know what a kimono looks like. It laps over and makes a V shape in front. And then, let's see, what else? Actually, these are fantasy Chinese women because look, they're wearing shoes, or they're wearing big shoes and you can see their feet. Real Chinese women at that time would have had bound feet, and their feet would have been hidden under their skirts, probably, if they were wearing long skirts. So those are some. Also, the sleeves are different. Again, the Chinese women are wearing a sort of a fitted jacket or bodice, whereas the way a kimono is put together is a sort of strips of cloth very loosely sewn. Is that enough to go by? And then even things like the textile patterns, those medallion patterns are very Chinese patterns. Yes, it's extremely interesting that the Japanese used women to operate the machines. That was also what was being done in the other industrial countries. It was the mill girls in Lowell who were operating the machines here. Basically, it was because women would work cheaper than men. There may also have been issues like manual dexterity. And I'm sorry to say, in many cases, it was children who were operating the machines, partly because they had tiny little fingers, and also partly because, again, they would work for cheap, or could be made to work for cheap.
I have the mic over here. I am wondering if in Hokusai's tremendous output of work, if he also did any series of the erotic prints, and do you have them in your collection?
Yes and yes. He did lots of erotic prints. It's represented in the exhibition with one erotic book. We actually, we have a wonderful collection of Japanese erotica that was assembled by William Sturgis Bigelow and was brought here in 1909, which was technically illegal, but Bigelow was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. And the president himself pulled strings to let Mr. Bigelow bring in the collection. It came from the docks straight to the museum, was immediately put under lock and key. It was for educational purposes. Yes, somewhat disappointingly, we don't have a lot of erotica specifically by Hokusai, although we do have a number of fine things by other artists. We have the book that I put on display in the exhibition is the best erotic piece by Hokusai that we have. The question that everyone always asks, and that even came up in the Boston Globe Review, is, do we have the famous octopus picture? No. It's a book illustration. Hokusai had an amazing imagination. He really did draw a picture of a woman having sex with an octopus. No, we do not own it. Would we exhibit it if we did? Yes, we would, and I'm sure it would be a huge draw. But since we don't have it, it's not relevant.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.